Tonight we begin with a strike that Kremlin officials had declared impossible, Western intelligence agencies had monitored in real time, and Ukrainian special forces had executed with surgical precision. A strike that unfolded not on the distant front lines, not in occupied territory, but in the heart of Moscow itself, within sight of the Kremlin walls. A single night that brought fire to the Russian capital. A single night that forced Vladimir Putin to utter a word he has avoided for 3 years' losses. A single night that proved no corner of Russia is beyond Ukraine's reach. What Ukraine did tonight crossed a threshold that Moscow had believed was untouchable. And when that threshold was crossed, Putin did not respond with his usual bluster. He did not threaten nuclear escalation. He did not promise swift revenge. He stood before cameras and for the first time since this war began, acknowledged that Russia was suffering. Ukraine struck with precision, with intelligence that should terrify every Russian official, and with a message that echoed through the halls of the Kremlin itself. This war will be fought on our terms, not yours. For weeks now, there had been indicators, not official Ukrainian announcements, not public military briefings, just indicators that Kiev was preparing something unprecedented. Ukraine has been aggressive with strikes on Russian territory. Yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their operations have followed a certain logic, a doctrine, almost a predictable pattern of targeting military infrastructure while avoiding strikes that could be seen as directly threatening Moscow. Oil refineries, ammunition depots, airfields, command posts, all legitimate military targets, all outside the capital. But what set off alarm bells in the Kremlin this week was that the pattern suddenly shifted. Intelligence officers who monitor Ukrainian drone capabilities know the warning signs: the sudden increase in reconnaissance flights over western Russia, the unusual testing of long-range systems near the border, the disappearance of known Ukrainian special operations units from their usual positions, the mysterious silence from intelligence networks that had been actively communicating for months. All of that activity went dark 72 hours ago. And whenever Ukraine's most elite units go dark, it means something extraordinary is being prepared, something that cannot afford detection, something designed to strike at the heart of Russian power. Early this morning, at approximately 03:15 Moscow time, residents of central Moscow reported multiple explosions in the area surrounding the Kremlin district. Within minutes, videos began circulating on Russian social media, showing fires burning in buildings less than 2 kilometers from Red Square. This was not a random attack. This was not a failed drone that wandered off course. This was a precision strike, the kind of targeted operation that Ukraine has only conducted when sending an unmistakable message to the Russian leadership. We can reach you. We know where your power centers are, and we can hit them whenever we choose. Western intelligence officials monitoring the situation initially believed this might be a symbolic strike, dramatic but limited in actual damage. Within hours, they revised that assessment completely. Ukrainian forces had struck at least 3 significant targets within the Kremlin district, including what analysts believe was a military coordination center that had been operating under civilian cover. And when a nation at war demonstrates it can strike military targets inside the enemy, its capital within sight of their leader residence, the psychological impact is immeasurable. The response from the Kremlin tonight was not what anyone expected. It was not defiant. It was not threatening. It was for the first time in this war subdued. Vladimir Putin, appearing in a hastily arranged address, described the strikes as provocative, escalatory. And then he said something that stopped analysts in their tracks. He acknowledged losses, a word he has systematically avoided for 3 years of conflict. But acknowledgement of losses only matters if it signals a change in strategy. And tonight, there are signs that something inside the Kremlin has shifted. Here's what we know. Within hours of the strikes, Russian air defense systems around Moscow were placed on their highest alert status, a status they have not maintained since the early days of the war. Emergency security protocols were activated throughout the capital and Russian state media, usually quick to spin any attack as a failed terrorist attempt, remained largely silent for over 4 hours. That silence speaks louder than any propaganda could. Tonight, Ukrainian military intelligence confirmed what Western agencies had already assessed. This operation had been planned for months. Ukraine struck before Russian air defenses could adapt to their new approach vectors. They hit a communications relay that connected Kremlin leadership to frontline commanders. They hit a logistics coordination center disguised as a civilian facility. They hit targets that Russian security services believed were invisible and untouchable. In other words, Ukraine didn't just strike Moscow. They demonstrated intelligence penetration at the highest levels of Russian security, the ability to identify hidden military facilities, the ability to track their operations, the ability to strike them with precision that minimized civilian casualties while maximizing strategic impact. This is what made Putin's acknowledgement of losses so significant. Russia's carefully constructed image of an impenetrable capital has been shattered, and Ukraine achieved this not with massive bombardment, but with surgical precision that left Russian defenses looking helpless. Not recklessly, not with indiscriminate destruction. but with the kind of targeted capability that keeps every Russian official wondering what else Ukraine knows and what else they can reach. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Military analysts now believe that Ukraine's strike on the Kremlin district was specifically designed to exploit a critical vulnerability in Russian psychology, the assumption that Moscow was a sanctuary. For 3 years, Russian citizens in the capital have lived relatively normal lives while their military devastated Ukrainian cities. That asymmetry has been central to Putin's domestic political strategy. The war happens far away. Russian life continues uninterrupted, and the costs remain those costs concrete. Tonight, Ukraine made those costs concrete. Fires burning within sight of the Kremlin. Explosions audible in central Moscow. The war for the first time arriving on doorsteps that had believed themselves safe. Defense analysts, speaking with Western media, described Russia's security posture as psychologically shattered, suddenly forced to confront a reality they had denied was possible. One former intelligence officer put it this way: Ukraine didn't just hit targets tonight. They hit the myth that Putin could protect his own capital. That matters because it shows Ukraine is fighting a psychological war as effectively as a military one. They are demonstrating to Russian citizens that this war has consequences. They are proving to Russian officials that nowhere is truly safe, and they are sending a message to Putin himself. Your walls cannot protect you. As reports continued coming in throughout the morning, we learned more about the scope of Ukraine's operation. Ukrainian long-range drones penetrated Russian airspace through corridors that Moscow's vaunted air defenses failed to cover, forcing emergency scrambles of interceptor aircraft. Ukrainian cyber units reportedly disrupted Moscow's emergency communication systems for nearly 30 minutes, delaying coordinated response. Ukrainian intelligence released precise coordinates of their targets after the strikes, demonstrating they knew exactly what they were hitting and why. This wasn't just a drone attack. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. This was a coordinated multi-domain operation executed at the highest level of military sophistication. This was Ukraine demonstrating capabilities that Russia did not believe they possessed. And capability demonstration is the one thing Russia has consistently underestimated throughout this war. For every defensive measure Russia has implemented, Ukraine has found a way around it. For every assumption Russia has made about Ukrainian limitations, Ukraine has proven them wrong. Remember, Putin believed Moscow was untouchable. He believed his air defenses were impenetrable. He believed the war would remain safely distant from Russian population centers. But tonight, the exact opposite happened. Ukrainian precision weapons struck targets in the capital itself. Russian air defenses failed to prevent the attack, and Putin was forced to acknowledge losses in a way he never has before. This is not the invincible Russia that state propaganda has portrayed. This is a nation suddenly vulnerable in ways its leadership never imagined. What makes this moment so dangerous is that this strike happened when Vladimir Putin is under immense internal pressure. Military commanders want more resources for a war that is consuming men and equipment at unsustainable rates. Oligarchs want an end to sanctions that have devastated their fortunes. Security officials want explanations for how Ukrainian weapons reached the capital, and the Russian public is waking up to videos of their city burning. Putin is balancing these impossible demands while his image of strength crumbles. And when leaders in that position face public humiliation, they rarely respond rationally. They respond from wounded pride. They respond from desperation. They respond with escalation designed to restore an image of power that has just been punctured. NATO's statement tonight was carefully calibrated to accomplish two things: support Ukraine's right to strike legitimate military targets while warning Russia against disproportionate escalation. Officials noted that Ukraine struck military coordination facilities, not civilian infrastructure. That precision matters under international law, and it signals that Ukraine is fighting this war within boundaries that Russia has repeatedly violated. You don't hear that kind of careful distinction from NATO unless they want to emphasize the legitimacy of Ukraine as actions while preparing for Russian retaliation. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky addressed his nation in a measured but powerful statement. He said, "Russia believed their capital was beyond our reach. Tonight, we proved them wrong." He said, "Every military target that supports the occupation of our land is a legitimate target. Distance does not provide immunity." And he said, "We did not start this war, but we will take it wherever necessary to end it." These are statements from a leader who understands the magnitude of what Ukraine just accomplished. This strike didn't happen in isolation. Along with the Kremlin district attack, Ukrainian forces launched coordinated strikes on Russian military positions in occupied Crimea. Ukrainian cyber operations disrupted Russian command networks across multiple sectors. Ukrainian intelligence released information suggesting they have detailed knowledge of other high-value targets inside Russia. When Ukraine moves on multiple fronts simultaneously, it means a new phase of this war has begun. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia will dramatically escalate attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure in retaliation. Another is that Russian security services will conduct massive internal investigations looking for intelligence leaks. A third possibility is that Putin, humiliated and desperate, may consider options that a more secure leader would never contemplate. But tonight, Ukraine demonstrated something crucial. They are willing to take risks that Russia did not anticipate. What we're watching now is a test of narratives. Russia wants to maintain the fiction that this war has no domestic consequences. Ukraine wants to prove that fiction is over. NATO wants to manage escalation while supporting Ukrainian operations. And the world wants to know whether this strike marks a turning point in a conflict that has already reshaped global security. As the hours pass, more details will emerge about exactly what Ukraine struck and what damage was inflicted. But what we already know is significant. Ukraine reached the Russian capital with precision weapons. Putin acknowledged losses publicly for the first time, and Moscow's image of invincibility has been shattered. What happens next depends on decisions being made in the Kremlin right now, but Ukraine has already proven that they can strike whenever and wherever they choose. And tonight, for the first time since this war began, Moscow is afraid. Not the distant front lines, not the occupied territories, Moscow itself. Because tonight, Ukraine taught Russia something they will never forget. This war has no safe zones. Distance provides no protection. And the Russian capital can burn just like Ukrainian cities have burned. This story is far from over, but tonight, one thing is absolutely clear. Ukraine reached Moscow, Putin admitted losses, and the war just changed forever.